4 weapons that changed ancient warfare and were then banned. War has always been humanity's most brutal classroom, where innovation meant survival and stagnation meant extinction. Throughout history, warriors and engineers pushed the boundaries of lethality, creating weapons so devastating that they didn't just change how battles were fought, they changed how entire civilizations thought about warfare itself. But here's the fascinating twist. Some of these game-changing weapons were so horrifying, so indiscriminate in their carnage, that even ancient societies, cultures not exactly known for their squeamishness, decided they'd crossed a line. These weren't weapons that failed, they succeeded too well. They were banned not because they didn't work, but precisely because they did. Today, we're diving into 4 weapons that revolutionized ancient warfare and then got themselves outlawed, restricted, or condemned by the very civilizations that created them. These are stories of innovation meeting morality, of military advantage colliding with human conscience, and of ancient peoples grappling with questions we still struggle with today. Just because we can build something terrible, does that mean we should? Let's start with a weapon that burned its way into history and then got extinguished by its own success. Greek fire stands as perhaps the most mysterious and terrifying incendiary weapon ever created in the ancient world. Developed by the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century, this liquid fire became the empire's most closely guarded military secret, a weapon so effective that it kept Constantinople safe for centuries, and so dangerous that its very existence sparked international outrage and eventual prohibition. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown to this day, lost when the Byzantine Empire fell. What we do know comes from contemporary accounts and the weapon's effects on the battlefield. Byzantine sources describe it as a liquid that could burn on water, couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, and stuck to whatever it touched like napalm. Modern scholars believe it likely contained petroleum or naphtha, combined with other substances like quicklime, sulfur, or saltpeter. Some theories suggest the mixture was pressurized and ignited as it sprayed from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, creating a flamethrower effect that could project streams of fire across the waves. The weapon's debut came during the Arab siege of Constantinople between 674 and 678 CE. The Islamic Caliphate had assembled a massive fleet, confident they could strangle the Byzantine capital into submission. They were wrong. Byzantine ships equipped with Greek fire devastated the Arab fleet, turning wooden warships into floating infernos. Sailors who jumped overboard found no escape. The fire followed them into the water, burning on the surface and clinging to their bodies. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Imagine being a sailor in that era, watching fire chase you across the ocean, defying everything you understood about the natural world. The Byzantines used Greek fire again in 717 CE during another Arab siege, with equally catastrophic results for the attackers. The weapon gave the Byzantine Empire a technological edge that compensated for their often inferior numbers. It was their atomic bomb, their ultimate deterrent, the weapon that made enemies think twice before challenging Constantinople's walls. But Greek fire's very effectiveness created problems. The weapon was indiscriminate and horrifying. It caused agonizing deaths, burned men alive in ways that even hardened medieval warriors found disturbing. Contemporary accounts describe the screams of burning sailors, the smell of roasting flesh, the nightmarish sight of men diving underwater repeatedly, desperately trying to escape flames that waited for them when they surfaced. The Byzantine emperors themselves recognized the moral weight of their superweapon. They restricted its use to defensive operations and situations of dire necessity. The formula was kept secret not just for strategic reasons, but also to prevent its proliferation. Only members of the imperial family and a select few chemists knew how to produce it, and they were sworn to secrecy on pain of death and eternal damnation. The Byzantines believed God had given them this weapon specifically to defend Christendom, and using it for aggressive conquest or sharing it with others would be blasphemy. This religious and moral dimension is crucial. Byzantine emperors received requests from allied Christian kingdoms for the secret of Greek fire, and they refused every single one. Emperor Constantine VII wrote explicitly that Greek fire was revealed by an angel to the first Christian emperor, and that sharing it would result in divine punishment. Whether this was genuine religious conviction or convenient propaganda, it represented an early form of weapons control, a recognition that some technologies are too dangerous to spread. Eventually, the weapon's use declined and its formula was lost. Some historians argue this was deliberate, that later Byzantine rulers chose to let the knowledge die rather than risk it falling into the wrong hands. Others suggest the loss was accidental, a consequence of the empire's gradual collapse. Either way, by the time Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Greek fire had already faded into legend. The legacy of Greek fire extends beyond its tactical applications. It represents one of the first instances of a weapon being restricted by its creators based on moral and religious grounds. The Byzantines developed something devastating, and then chose to limit its use and prevent its spread. That's remarkable for any era, but especially for medieval warfare, where brutality was standard operating procedure. Now let's turn to a weapon that took the opposite approach, not fire, but poison, and not from the Byzantine Empire, but from ancient India and Asia. Poison weapons have existed for as long as humans have fought each other, but the systematic use of toxic substances on arrows, spears, and blades reached its zenith in ancient India and Southeast Asia. These weren't crude applications of random toxins. They were sophisticated chemical weapons programs that would impress modern military scientists. And like Greek fire, they eventually became so controversial that religious, legal, and cultural prohibitions emerged to restrict their use. The ancient Indians developed an entire science around poison warfare, documented in texts like the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft written around the 3rd century BCE. This wasn't just about dipping arrows in snake venom. Indian toxicologists cultivated poisonous plants, bred venomous creatures, and developed complex recipes that combined biological and mineral poisons to maximize lethality. They understood concepts like dose-response relationships, delayed action toxins, and even antidotes. One particularly nasty concoction involved aconite, also known as wolfsbane, combined with snake venom and various plant extracts. Arrows treated with this mixture could kill within hours, causing paralysis, convulsions, and respiratory failure. Other recipes produced slower-acting poisons that allowed warriors to escape before their victims realized they'd been fatally wounded. Some Indian kingdoms maintained special units of archers trained specifically in poison warfare, complete with protocols for handling toxic substances safely. The Scythians, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppes, developed their own poison arrow technology. They used a particularly gruesome mixture involving decomposed viper venom, human blood, and animal dung, left to ferment until it became a toxic paste. Greek historians wrote about the terror Scythian arrows inspired, describing wounds that turned gangrenous almost immediately, causing death even from minor injuries. In Southeast Asia, the use of poison blow darts became highly refined. Various tribes developed incredibly potent toxins from tree frogs, plants, and other natural sources. The Dayak people of Borneo created poison from the upas tree that could kill a human in minutes. These weren't just hunting tools. They were weapons of war that gave smaller, less armored forces the ability to kill heavily equipped warriors with a single hit. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite their effectiveness, poison weapons faced widespread condemnation and prohibition across multiple ancient cultures. The reasons were complex, mixing practical concerns with moral and religious objections. In ancient India, despite the Arthasastra's detailed instructions on poison use, the Dharmasastra texts, which governed ethical and legal conduct, explicitly condemned poison weapons as dishonorable. The Manusmriti, an important Hindu legal text, listed poison among the weapons forbidden to warriors of the Kshatriya caste. Using poison was considered cowardly, a violation of Dharma, the cosmic order that governed righteous behavior. A true warrior faced his enemy openly, testing skill against skill, courage against courage. Poison subverted this ideal, allowing the weak to kill the strong, the coward to murder the brave. This wasn't mere philosophical musing. Historical records show Indian kingdoms that used poison weapons faced diplomatic consequences. Neighboring states considered such use grounds for breaking treaties and forming alliances against the offender. Poison warfare was associated with Mleka, barbarians and outcasts, not civilized kingdoms. The ancient Greeks and Romans held similar views. While they certainly knew about poison and occasionally used it for assassinations, its use in open warfare was considered barbaric. Greek hoplites prided themselves on fighting in organized phalanxes, testing discipline and courage. Roman legionaries built an empire through superior tactics and training. Poison undermined the entire value system that gave warfare meaning in these societies. This moral stance had practical foundations too. Poison weapons were dangerous to everyone, including the user. Soldiers could accidentally poison themselves while preparing weapons or treating wounds. Toxins didn't discriminate between friend and foe. A dropped poisoned arrow was a hazard to anyone who encountered it. And unlike conventional weapons, poison could contaminate water supplies, food stores, and entire areas, causing civilian casualties that even ancient armies found excessive. There was also the problem of escalation. If one side used poison, the other would retaliate in kind, leading to conflicts where both armies suffered from toxic weapons. This created a perverse incentive structure where everyone was worse off. Ancient leaders, despite their reputation for brutality, could recognize mutual destruction when they saw it. Religious prohibitions reinforced these practical and moral objections. In Hinduism, Buddhism, and later Islam, the use of poison in warfare was condemned as a sin. Buddhist texts specifically mention poison weapons as violations of ahimsa, the principle of nonviolence. Islamic scholars debated the issue extensively, with most concluding that poison was haram in warfare because it caused unnecessary suffering and violated principles of honorable combat. These prohibitions weren't perfectly enforced. Desperate kingdoms sometimes used poison anyway, but they established norms that shaped ancient warfare. The very existence of these taboos tells us something important. Even in societies where human life was cheap and warfare was constant, people drew lines about acceptable violence. Let's move now from poison to a weapon that revolutionized siege warfare and then got itself banned for being too effective. The crossbow represents one of ancient warfare's great paradoxes. It was a technological marvel that democratized military power, allowing peasants to kill knights and untrained soldiers to threaten professional warriors. It was also so threatening to the established order that it faced multiple prohibition attempts, most famously by the Catholic Church itself. The crossbow's origins trace back to ancient China, where it appeared around the 5th century BCE. By the 3rd century BCE, Chinese armies were fielding thousands of crossbowmen equipped with sophisticated weapons featuring bronze triggers, precise sights, and impressive range. The crossbow gave Chinese states a significant advantage over steppe nomads who relied on traditional bows. It required less training than a conventional bow. You could teach a farmer to use a crossbow effectively in days, while training a skilled archer took years. The weapon spread westward, appearing in Greece and Rome. Roman armies used crossbows, called arqueballista or manuballista, though they never became as central to Roman tactics as they were in China. After Rome's fall, the crossbow largely disappeared from European warfare for several centuries, only to re-emerge in the 10th and 11th centuries with improved designs. The European crossbow that emerged in the Middle Ages was a formidable weapon. It could punch through chain mail and even some plate armor at close range. It had greater range and accuracy than most conventional bows, and critically, it required minimal training. A crossbowman didn't need the years of practice that created an English longbowman. This accessibility made the crossbow revolutionary and threatening. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal decree at the Second Lateran Council that banned the use of crossbows in warfare between Christians. The decree called the weapon deadly and hateful to God and prohibited its use, along with regular bows, against Christians, though it remained permissible against Muslims and other non-Christians. This was extraordinary, the Church attempting to ban a military technology on moral grounds. Why did the crossbow inspire such condemnation? The reasons were complex, mixing genuine moral concern with protection of social hierarchy. From a moral perspective, the crossbow enabled killing at a distance with minimal skill or courage. It allowed a coward hiding behind fortifications to kill a brave knight charging into battle. This violated medieval concepts of honorable combat, where valor and skill should determine victory. But there was also a class dimension. Medieval society was built on a military aristocracy, knights who spent lifetimes training for war, who could afford expensive armor and weapons, who formed the military elite. The crossbow threatened this entire system. A peasant with a crossbow could kill a knight who trained since childhood, who wore armor worth a fortune, who represented the pinnacle of military achievement. This was socially destabilizing in a way modern people might struggle to appreciate. Imagine spending your entire life training to be the ultimate warrior, investing enormous resources in equipment and horses, deriving your social status from your military prowess, and then some farmer you've never met kills you from 200 yards away with a weapon he learned to use last week. The crossbow didn't just kill knights, it killed the idea that military excellence required noble birth and lifetime dedication. The Church's ban was spectacularly unsuccessful. Crossbows continued to proliferate across Europe because they were simply too useful. Kings and generals who faced enemies equipped with crossbows couldn't afford to handicap their own forces. The weapon's tactical advantages outweighed religious prohibition. By the 13th century, crossbows were standard equipment in most European armies, and the papal ban was effectively dead. But the ban's failure doesn't diminish its significance. It represented an institutional attempt to control military technology based on moral and social concerns. The Church recognized that the crossbow changed warfare in ways that troubled them, and they tried to stop it. That they failed tells us something about the limits of moral authority when confronting technological change, a lesson that remains relevant today. The crossbow also faced restrictions in other cultures for similar reasons. In Japan, the samurai class viewed crossbows and later firearms with disdain, considering them weapons unworthy of warriors. While Japan did use these weapons, particularly in siege warfare, they never achieved the same status as the sword or bow. This wasn't just snobbery, it reflected genuine concern that these weapons undermined the values that gave the samurai identity and purpose. Finally, let's examine a weapon system that combined technology and tactics to create something so devastating that it sparked one of ancient warfare's most famous prohibitions. War elephants were the ancient world's tanks, mobile fortresses that could break enemy formations, trample infantry, and strike terror into opposing armies. Originating in India and spreading across Asia, North Africa, and even into Europe, war elephants represented a massive investment in military technology. They were also controversial, facing restrictions and outright bans in various contexts because of their unpredictability, the suffering they caused, and their tendency to create indiscriminate carnage. The use of war elephants dates back to at least the first millennium BCE in India, where kingdoms trained Asian elephants for combat. These weren't just beasts of burden, they were sophisticated weapon platforms. Elephants carried armored warriors in howdahs, wooden or metal platforms mounted on their backs. They wore armor themselves, sometimes including bladed tusks that could slash through enemy ranks. Drivers called mahouts controlled them using voice commands and pressure from hooks. A charging war elephant was a terrifying sight. Standing 10 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing several tons. These animals could scatter infantry formations, crush soldiers underfoot, and create chaos in enemy ranks. They were also psychological weapons. Horses unused to elephants would panic and flee, and soldiers facing a wall of charging elephants often broke before contact. The tactical advantages were clear, which is why war elephants spread throughout the ancient world. The Persians adopted them from India. The Carthaginians famously used North African elephants, with Hannibal bringing dozens across the Alps to terrorize Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt deployed elephants against their rivals. The Seleucid Empire maintained elephant core as a core component of their military. But war elephants had serious problems. They were expensive to maintain, requiring enormous amounts of food and specialized handlers. They were vulnerable to certain tactics. Roman soldiers learned to target the mahouts or wound the elephants themselves, causing them to rampage uncontrollably. And that's where things got really problematic. A panicked or wounded war elephant didn't just become ineffective. It became a threat to everyone nearby, including its own side. Ancient battles are filled with accounts of elephants trampling their own troops, charging backward through friendly formations, creating more casualties among allies than enemies. The Macedonian king Pyrrhus, whose victories against Rome were so costly they gave us the term Pyrrhic victory, lost battles partly because his elephants turned on his own troops. This unpredictability led to restrictions and prohibitions. After several disastrous experiences with war elephants, some ancient armies simply stopped using them. The Romans, despite conquering elephant-using enemies, never adopted the creatures themselves, partly because they'd seen too many elephants turn into liabilities. More interesting are the explicit treaties and agreements restricting elephant warfare. After the Third Macedonian War, Rome imposed a treaty on the Seleucid Empire that limited the number of war elephants they could maintain. This wasn't just about reducing military capacity. It reflected Roman recognition that elephants represented a particularly destabilizing military technology. Indian texts on warfare, including the Arthashastra, contain extensive regulations about when and how war elephants should be used. These weren't just tactical guidelines, they were ethical prescriptions. Using elephants against civilian populations was condemned. Deploying them in ways likely to cause indiscriminate casualties was restricted. These rules recognized that war elephants, like other powerful weapons, needed regulation to prevent excessive suffering. The Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, who ruled much of India in the 3rd century BCE, famously renounced war elephants along with warfare generally after witnessing the carnage of the Kalinga War. His edicts, inscribed on pillars throughout his empire, condemned the use of violence and specifically mentioned war elephants as instruments of suffering that should be abandoned. While Ashoka's pacifism was unusual for an ancient ruler, his specific concern about elephants reflected broader anxieties about these weapons. There were also practical prohibitions. Some ancient cities and states banned war elephants from entering their territories, even during peacetime. This was partly about preventing surprise attacks, but also about the danger the animals posed. An elephant could rampage through a city, causing massive destruction. Keeping them outside city walls was a sensible precaution. Religious and cultural taboos also emerged. In some Buddhist and Jain communities, using elephants for warfare was considered sinful because it involved harming animals and exploiting them for violence. These religious objections didn't stop elephant warfare entirely, but they created moral pressure against the practice. The decline of war elephants came gradually. Improved anti-elephant tactics made them less effective. The rise of gunpowder weapons made them increasingly vulnerable and obsolete. But even before their tactical obsolescence, elephants faced restrictions and prohibitions that reflected ancient peoples' recognition that this weapon system was problematic, powerful but unpredictable, effective but prone to causing indiscriminate suffering. So what do these 4 weapons, Greek fire, poison, crossbows, and war elephants, tell us about ancient warfare and human nature? First, they demonstrate that concerns about weapons ethics aren't modern inventions. We often assume that ancient peoples were brutally pragmatic, willing to use any method to win. But the historical record shows something more complex. Ancient societies wrestled with questions about acceptable violence, developing prohibitions and restrictions on weapons they found too destructive, too indiscriminate, or too contrary to their values. Second, these cases reveal the tension between military effectiveness and social values. Each of these weapons worked, that was the problem. They were banned or restricted not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that troubled people. Greek fire was too horrible, poison was too cowardly, crossbows were too democratic, war elephants were too unpredictable. These weren't technical failures, they were moral challenges. Third, we see that weapons prohibitions have always been difficult to enforce. The papal ban on crossbows failed because tactical necessity trumped religious authority. Poison prohibitions were violated when kingdoms grew desperate. War elephant treaties were broken when military advantage demanded it. This pattern continues today. Weapons treaties and prohibitions exist, but they're only as strong as the will to enforce them and the belief that everyone benefits from compliance. Fourth, these stories show how weapons can threaten social orders. The crossbow didn't just kill knights, it threatened the entire feudal system. War elephants didn't just trample soldiers, they disrupted the predictable patterns of ancient warfare. New weapons can destabilize societies in ways that go beyond their immediate tactical effects, and ancient peoples recognized this even if they couldn't always prevent it. Finally, these cases remind us that the relationship between technology and morality is ancient and ongoing. Every generation faces weapons that push boundaries and challenge assumptions about acceptable violence. Our ancestors dealt with Greek fire and poison arrows. We deal with autonomous weapons and cyber warfare. The technologies change, but the fundamental questions remain. What makes a weapon too terrible to use? Who decides? And how do we balance military necessity against human values? The ancient weapons we've examined were eventually superseded by new technologies. Greek fire gave way to gunpowder. Poison arrows became obsolete as armor improved and battlefield medicine advanced. Crossbows evolved into firearms. War elephants couldn't compete with artillery, but the moral and practical questions they raised never became obsolete. Today, we continue debating weapons restrictions on chemical weapons, biological agents, autonomous systems, and nuclear arms. We're still trying to draw lines between acceptable and unacceptable violence, still struggling to enforce prohibitions when military advantage beckons, still discovering that the most dangerous weapons are often the most tempting to use. The ancients who banned Greek fire, condemned poison, restricted crossbows, and regulated war elephants were grappling with the same fundamental challenge we face: how to be human in the midst of inhumanity, how to maintain moral boundaries when survival seems to demand their violation, how to prevent warfare from consuming the very values we fight to protect. They didn't always succeed. Many of their prohibitions failed or were inconsistently enforced, but they tried, and that matters. They recognized that some weapons cross lines that shouldn't be crossed, that military advantage isn't worth every moral cost, that humanity requires limits even in humanity's most brutal endeavor. These four weapons changed ancient warfare by being too effective, too terrible, too destabilizing. They were innovations that succeeded beyond what their societies could accept. And in banning or restricting them, ancient peoples sent a message across the centuries that even in war, especially in war, we must remain human. That's a lesson we're still learning, still struggling to apply, still desperately needing to remember. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more videos on history never taught in school.